All right, today these are the topics that we're going to cover in the training. The theological and historical overview. That's the first section. Pastoral concerns regarding hospital and home visits, and practical concerns concerning the administration of the sacrament. You all have, or should have, this manual, a practical manual for Eucharistic visitors. Everything that I'm going to say, as far as historical overview and some of the other, is in this book. So you do not need to take extensive notes. Just listen while I'm talking and think about some kind of questions that you might want to ask after each section. And I will give a chance after I've finished each section for you to ask questions. Regarding the history of Eucharistic visiting by lay people, it is a very ancient practice. When the church was worshiping in synagogues right after the resurrection, people gathered in each other's homes for church. They were on the run. They were not being accepted in the local community. Christians weren't. So they gathered in each other's homes, and they had a good old, like we all do, potluck supper. People brought food, and food was available, and they had a lot of conversation about Easter and the resurrection. There was no organized liturgy at that time. People just talked about their experience with Easter and the resurrection. And then, as time went on and the need arose, they began to set certain lay people aside for different ministries in the church. Maybe they did begin to have an altar guild, and maybe they did begin to have a choir. And then they realized that there were some people who often couldn't come to church. Maybe they had started out in the church, in people's homes, but now they couldn't come for various reasons. And so some people were set aside to take communion, which was the bread and the wine that was left over, home to those who couldn't be there present at the holy meal that they had. Now, I'm also telling you that this took some time. This is not all done within the first 3 months. This began to be done over maybe 100 years or so. We have written down some historians who were much in favor of this kind of ministry, taking communion home to the people who couldn't be there. And we also have some who began to be against it for various reasons. For example, the historian HYPOLOTUS describes the fact that lay people and deacons were the first ministers after the apostles, took communion home to the widows and the sick people. Another historian, Eusebius, tells the story of a young boy who took communion home to his grandfather who was dying. Later on, Ambrose, another historian, recognized the need for this. Now, we're in the 4th century. Recognized the need for this kind of ministry. But there was another historian named Jerome who challenged this need. His fear was that it would be misused, that perhaps the young boy would take it home with him and he would give the communion to his grandfather. But okay, now there's some more left over. What do I do with that? So misuse could be a problem with that. So there was a lot of back and forth over the course of early church history as to how much this was recognized as a need and how much people were criticizing it because it might be misused. So we get into the fact that, all right, now we're into a few later centuries, and a liturgy began to arose, and there was a need for ordained clergy. Now, when Constantine became the emperor of Rome, Christianity was the norm. in his empire. This was about the beginning of the 4th century. Christianity was legal. There wasn't quite as much persecution of Christians. And so it was easier for this kind of ministry to take place. However, time changed even more when we get to the Middle Ages, and liturgies became very elaborate. There were now 3 orders of clergy, deacons, priests, and bishops, and they began to take possession of the Eucharistic liturgy. And actually, fewer and fewer of the lay people took communion at all. There was a big chasm which developed between the clergy and the people. In some cathedrals and in some parish churches here in our diocese, there was what we call a rood screen. You know what that is? It's ornate carving which separates the choir and the altar area from the congregation. Now, some congregations have taken that away, some have opened it up a little bit, but this is a remnant of the Middle Ages, which separated the clergy from the people. So when the Reformation came along, things began to develop so that there were changes, and the language of the church became the language of the people. And we know that Gutenberg produced a Bible that was in the language of the people, and eventually some of the liturgy went into the language of the people. And some of us remember even in our lifetime when the Roman Catholic Church stopped using Latin in church and started using English. So it took a long time for things to become so that it was available for everybody. And at that point in time, there was an attempt to restore more frequent communion of the people. Until then, the people were maybe receiving communion only once a year. And this also took some time so that people would get used to it. Sometimes communion in the Middle Ages was associated with the abuses of the church. When we get into a little more modern time, for example, in the Vatican in 1975, there was an attempt to restore many of the old practices, to take the church back to the ancient church so that there was more participation by lay people, there was more openness about the liturgy, and the people could take more part in the liturgy. So the centrality of the Eucharist, remember before we didn't always have communion every Sunday. We have communion now every Sunday, and there is a greater participation by the laity in the service than there was before. So in the Episcopal Church, let's get to that for a minute, the Episcopal Church and the General Convention decided to get on board with this modernization of the liturgy and the use of practices which were from ancient times. However, just so you know, they're not finished yet. They're still working on it. Every convention comes along, they tweak something about lay ministries. But in 1967, lay people were allowed to begin to administer the chalice. And so, if you're as old as I am or near that, you may remember that there was a gentleman, usually, who was vested, who helped to serve the chalice. And he also read at the lectern. In 1985, the General Convention said that, okay, we can now begin to take the communion out of the church to the sick and the dying. And then in 1988, only 3 years later, so they're getting a little more excited about lay people being involved in the church, they separated out the lay Eucharistic ministers, otherwise known as chalicers today, and lay Eucharistic visitors, because they felt that there were different skill set involved in those two ministries. So today we have flourishing Eucharistic visiting throughout our diocese and in the Episcopal Church. And I remember when that started, it was really difficult for the people who were at home to accept the fact that, first, women, deacons, were bringing communion to them, and second, okay, now I have a lay person coming. When did that happen? And so to catch the people up who are at home with the people who are in the congregation, with the general convention, is very difficult. And so we have to keep explaining things. However, I notice now that many parishes in our diocese, the people who've been there for almost a generation, just take it as a habit that, okay, I'm sick, I can't go to church, when are you going to send me a Eucharistic visitor? They're ready. So I think that that is a good sign, that this has become very accepted, and you won't have some of the problems that earlier Eucharistic visitors have had.
While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body."
Bless it. Take.
What did you hear? Take,
Break.
break,
Took, blessed,
bless,
broke, and gave.
gave. Those are the four actions. Let's hear it once more, and now concentrate on those four actions.
While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body."
All right, now, does this sound familiar to you at all? This is what happens on Sunday. The priest lifts it up off the plate. He takes it. He blesses it. And he then breaks it. And he gives it to the people in the congregation. So this is an old Jewish practice that happened at the Sabbath meal. And you heard Jesus did this during the meal that he had with his disciples and followers. Okay, now let's listen to first Mark 8:6, and I'll listen more carefully so we don't miss anything.
Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd.
Very good. Now that we recognize this story, this is called the
Loaves and fishes.
loaves and fishes. Otherwise, this is the feeding of the
5,000.
5,000. Very good. Let's hear it once more.
Then he ordered the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and gave thanks, and giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute, and they distributed them to the crowd.
All righty. He gave it to, who did he give it to?
His disciples.
Were they ordained ministers of the church at that time? No, they were lay people. So this is the beginning of lay people helping in the liturgy, actually. And they distributed, so that Eucharistic visitors now are also part of the distributing of the elements of the Eucharist. And you see lay Eucharistic ministers, the chalicers. You see lay Eucharistic visitors, who are yourselves, who are now able to distribute the elements of the Eucharist to other people. So this is going back now to the early church, what we do today. Everybody assembled, everybody is part of the church. Even those people who are not present during the service are part of the service. And there's a strong sense of all belonging, one body and one bread. A strong sense that everybody should be part of the church's ministry, and everybody should be part of the church's actions and worship. So, if you look in, and you don't have to look now, but if you look in the ordination of deacons, there's an early practice for the deacons to take the Eucharist and be part of this particular ministry. And so in today's church, we like to have the deacons be the overseers of the Eucharistic visitors. Now, they can send that responsibility to a layperson and then help that layperson with the oversight of the Eucharistic visitors. Also, I would suggest that these people consult with each other, the clergy in charge and the layperson in charge, with exactly how they're going to function as a group in their congregation. I also like to mention that there are certain things that are expected, that the Eucharistic visitors will not feel that they are in a ministry by themselves. They're not sent out there and they're all by themselves on Sunday morning. Yes, they are, but that they're part of a group, they're part of the congregation, and they should be nurtured together as a group of Eucharistic visitors. It is recommended that the Eucharistic visitors get together and talk about their ministry with each other. Now, there's some things which we, the HIPAA laws, we try to keep some things private, but in the group of Eucharistic visitors, some of those things can be shared, but they can definitely be shared with the clergy person in charge. Eucharistic visitors are not 100% separated from clergy. They work together with the clergy. So that if a Eucharistic visitor notices a change in the person that they're visiting, they should report that to the clergy person so that they are aware of the health and conditions of the person that are being visited. It is specifically recommended, and this is very important that you note, that following, the canon says, and I'm going to read it, this is what the canon says, the canon being the church law, that directly following a celebration of the Holy Eucharist on Sunday or other regularly scheduled celebrations, taking the sacrament consecrated at the celebration to members of the congregation whom by reason of illness or infirmity were unable to be present at the celebration. This does not mean that you get the kit in church on Sunday and decide to go Monday, Tuesday, or whatever day suits you. It means that you go out to make your visit on the day that you receive the kit. This being an emphasis for the fact that you are still part of the congregation and you are still in communion with the people that you left and with the person that you're going to, so that you don't just willy-nilly go around and give communion following the reception of the kit. This is important for you to know. Sometimes it's not convenient for the person that you're going to visit to have you right after the church service. They may be eating lunch. So you need to clear some time on that Sunday so that maybe 2 o'clock you can go, or 3 o'clock. But that day, you must go and visit your person. You can go, if your congregation has a weekly Eucharist healing service on Wednesday or Thursday or whatever day you have it, you can receive the kit that day. If you're not a working person, if you're retired, you can receive the kit that day and go out and visit your assigned person. So it is important that you notice that there is a connection between the congregation, you, and the person that you're visiting, so that it all flows together, and by Tuesday, you have forgotten, or that spirit of being in the congregation isn't with you anymore. And you're now going out. That's not what it's supposed to be. You're supposed to still be feeling that you're a part of the congregation that you left. Alrighty, now we're ready for the 1 Peter reading.
Like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of Him who called you out of darkness into His marvelous light.
Okay, my question here is, this is the reading that is talking about the relationship of you to your congregation, which I just sort of talked about a minute ago. This is the reading which says, you are now chosen out of your congregation to do this work. You are part of the holy priesthood. This is not just a function that you do. It's like a vocation. It's a calling. And as I said a few minutes ago, you are complementing the role of the clergy. And that's why you report back to them when you see some changes. Or if you're in a really small parish, you can maybe catch your priest or deacon and say, you know, I visited so-and-so today, and we had a great visit. So that you're reporting back, but you're not, you're in conversation with everybody in the church about the visit that you had. And to do this means that you are, you need to be responsible to this ministry. You have already started by attending this training. And when you go back to your own congregation, you are going to be having a little more training on the congregational level about their practices. For example, where do you sign in that you have been out to visit? You must be accountable for your visit, saying, this is the day I went, these are the numbers of people who received communion, including yourself, and this then is recorded by the parish in the annual parochial report as a home communion. And it complements what the clergy do. And they're still giving communion to sick people in the hospital, for example, or dying people if you can't get there. So all of this is recorded as part of the outreach to the parishioners who cannot attend church on a regular basis. And one more thing that you need to be aware that you should do is to take the sexual misconduct training that the diocese offers. All people who are going to be out representing the church in situations where they may be alone with somebody needs to take this training. Now, one of the most important things that we want you to do when you are going out to visit is to establish a pastoral relationship with the person that you are visiting. And I'll get back to this at a later time, because this is very important. This is you and the person you visit establishing a relationship. And you know the saying, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together, Jesus is part of it. And you need to get together with that person so that you feel your relationship is a holy one. And you'll be amazed what happens when that begins to mature. You let go of some of your inhibitions, and they let go of some of theirs, and you begin to learn their story, and they begin to learn your story. And a relationship is truly formed at that point. And this doesn't happen immediately. This happens over time. In the very beginning, though, I do recommend that the person who is overseeing your program of Eucharistic visitors take you the first time to visit the person that you're going to be assigned to, because they already know you and they know the person you're going to visit, so that they can break in and get this relationship started. It's also very helpful because they know how to do this, and you're just starting out, and you're nervous, and well, when do I give the cup, and do I give it to them first or me first, or how that all goes. And so they are sort of a calming factor in the first visit when you're learning how to do it. Now we're into the second part, which you see listed on the board, the pastoral concerns regarding hospital and home visitation. First of all, you are visiting somebody, as we have mentioned, who is not currently part of the congregation. You are bringing them the sacrament from the congregation. The sacrament itself is a vehicle for healing. This is a ministry of healing. It's a ministry of presence, your presence with this person. You may find that when you go to visit, this person is agitated about something in their life or from their family. And most often it is something their family is doing that they are not part of the decision-making of anymore. And so when you come, you bring a calming effect, you bring the Eucharist, and they know right away what this means. You are also bringing a ministry of presence. You are bringing the congregation to these people. You are also reminding them of the days that they spent in the congregation. I often recommend that when people go out to visit and they start to establish this relationship with the person they're visiting, that they find out from the person, when did you go to church? Were you an 8 o'clocker? Did you go at 10:15? Did you only go on the Thursday healing service? Who did you sit near? Do you keep in touch with those people? Because this is part of bringing them into the congregation again. And if you find out where they did sit, perhaps you would go to that liturgy one time and introduce yourselves to the people who sit around them, who they might remember, and say, do you remember Mrs. Adams, who used to sit here every single Sunday? And talk a little bit with them about her, because they're wondering how she's doing. I mean, without giving out too much information about her medical condition and so forth, but they're wondering how she's doing. They may have sat next to her in the knitting group or the cooking group or something, and they're wondering about her. And then when you get back to visiting her, you can tell them, oh, you know that lady, Mrs. Taylor, you used to sit next to? She's got 5 grandchildren now. And that brings the person that you're visiting back into connection with the congregation. So this is a ministry of healing and a ministry of presence, but it is also a ministry of hope. Now, hope being, it's a foretaste of the heavenly banquet, which we're all going to be experiencing when we die. So this is all part of your ministry. So you need to be prepared for this. I suggest that each congregation has a commissioning service for the people who have been now trained for Eucharistic visiting. This way, the congregation sees who the new Eucharistic visitors are. I suggest also that it's a good idea when you are sent out every Sunday that you go to the front of the church and you receive the kit from the deacon or other clergy, and that there is a connection made. And I was part of St. James in Lancaster as the deacon, and I always asked the people who were going out, because they didn't always tell me in advance who they were visiting, I would say, Jack, who are you visiting today? And even though I probably had made the assignment, I can't always remember how many different assignments I've made. But by saying, Jack, who are you visiting today? And he coming back and saying to me, I'm visiting Bob Smith. The whole congregation hears that, and that is the prayer that the congregation then gives to that person and to the person that they are receiving the Eucharist from. They go out and they are both mentioned in front of the whole congregation. I suggest also that you make sure that you schedule yourself with plenty of time for this ministry. This is not something you rush out to do after church. As I said a few minutes ago, convenience is something that needs to be taken into consideration as far as allowing time. So call the person or establish a regular Sunday that you go. And sometimes with older people in nursing homes, that's more effective, because a call, then they'll say, oh, is it this Sunday? Or was it last Sunday? Or is it next Sunday you're coming? But if you say, I'm going to come every second Sunday of the month, that helps them to get established with a regularity for their communion. I often say that you need to take with you the Sunday bulletin. Well, there's not one here for me to share, but take the Sunday bulletin, which often gives the calendar of what's going on at church. That connects them again back to the parish. It also gives them an idea what kind of music was used in church on Sunday. And if they want to, they can look it up. Or you can say, oh, the choir had an excellent anthem today during the offertory. Keep them connected to the liturgy that you experienced. In these small, here's an example of a order of service that's used by one parish. Here's an example of this order of service used by St. Luke's here. And this is one that the National Church, that is put out through the Forward Movement. The reading of the Gospel is part of all of these liturgies. And after the Gospel is read, I often suggest that some thoughts are presented as to how that was interpreted by the preacher. And you can say to the person that you're visiting, how did you hear this? Because they're confined in their life, and it may not mean the same to them as it does to what the preacher is telling the people who are going to go out to work next week. So I would suggest that it's not a bad idea to take notes during the sermon. And it was always very clear to me who was going to be the Eucharistic visitors on the Sunday that I preached, because I could see them taking notes from the pulpit. And I thought, oh, isn't this wonderful? They've taken my suggestion. And they go out and they have, and they told this joke and they told that story. And this all brought the gospel home to the people in the congregation. But be sure that also, while you're talking about the sermon, the gospel reading, that those people have an understanding of what it means for them in their life. I will say also that when you're out doing this ministry, if you're in your midlife or younger, or in any stage actually, you will learn a lot from the people that you are visiting. You will learn about their faith journey. You will learn about how their faith and their life have worked out together. And you will learn a lot. I'll just tell you that. Sometimes they will have questions, though. Questions which you might not be able to answer about. I had one lady one time who said to me, I don't really understand the virgin birth. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not sure I do either. But I was able to refer her to the prayer book, to the catechism, where it is explained in plain language. And I said, the next time I come, we'll talk about that together. You read it, you think about it, and we'll talk about it together. And then my plan was, and if she still doesn't understand it, I'll bring in the priest or somebody who can really explain it to her better than I probably can. So don't be afraid to say, oh, I really don't understand that myself, because we're all on a journey, and we may not understand it until another phase of our life comes along. And that's the time when that person is trying to clarify it for themselves. So I would say that be aware that you're going to grow in your faith as well during this experience of being a Eucharistic minister. I also suggest, and I kind of mentioned this before, that the person you're going to visit be prepared for you to come. Either a phone call from the person in charge of the Eucharistic ministers, them accompanying you on your first visit. I want the ministry of the Eucharistic visitor explained to that person so that they know that they're not being now moved down. Where's my rector? Well, if the rector can't come, where's my deacon? Now you're coming? They need to understand that this is all working together and that they're not being put aside in favor of you, who are now bringing them the Eucharist. And bringing them the Eucharist with another motive, in a way, the relationship that you're going to form. Okay? You need to prepare this person every Sunday by a phone call, or, as I said a few minutes ago, establishing the second Sunday of the month as your regular time, and then say, all right, I'm going to be visiting you regularly. Some of my visitors that I had at St. James would also connect with them by sending them in the mail the bulletin every single Sunday. They connected when they went away on vacation by sending them a postcard. One dear lady, when they had their family dessert the night before, cut a piece of the pie that she made and took it to the person that she's visiting. I mean, I think she had asked if this was okay beforehand, but that gave the person she was visiting a really intimate experience with her and her family too. Some of the people, when they're visiting, go with another person. You can take your spouse. You can take your children. Something that arose one time out of the group meetings that we had with the Eucharistic visitors together, one lady was saying to the group, I'm visiting a gentleman who really doesn't talk much. And of course, I had purposely sent to him the most talkative Eucharistic visitor I had on my team. And when she had a problem getting him to talk, I knew that this was going to be even difficult for her, but in a way that was a growing experience for her. When she came to the visitor meeting, she asked all the visitors, do any of you know this person? And one of the other visitors said, yes, I worked with him in the chemical department at Armstrong Cork Company. And he often talked about tying his own fishing flies and playing chess. And so she got the bright idea to take her sons with her on the visit. And they were 10, 12 years old. And so he showed them how to play chess. And with them, he found out that they had both been newspaper delivery people. And he regaled these boys with fantastic stories about delivering the newspaper when he was a boy in the city of Philadelphia. Now, you know in Philadelphia how the buildings are very close together in the housing neighborhoods. And he didn't just throw it on their steps. He jumped from building to building and threw the newspaper down from the roof onto the front porch. And so she was a little concerned that her sons would start with that. But anyway, he regaled them with these stories, and that was the first time she really felt he was relaxed in conversation. And at the end, she knew a lot about that man's life. This led from one thing to another. And when it came time to have his funeral, she was the one we asked to give the homily because she knew him so well. So I would say that while you are getting to know this person, you need to, what I was worried about here with some of these is that they don't have any prayers of the people, whereas this one that I have here does have prayers of the people in it. However, it says prayers, and you can always use prayers of the people from the prayer book. But before you start with the prayers of the people from the prayer book, or any prayers, ask the person that you're visiting what they would like to lift up in prayer. You may be amazed what you hear. Signing in, doing the training back in your local, which means returning the kit. Do they want it washed or do they want you to wash it? Where do we sign in the book? This depends on, is the church open on Monday when they bring it back? Or do you want the kit back by Wednesday? Which means they're probably going to have to wash the kit at home, or wash the cup at least at home, before they bring it to you, back to the church. So this is the kind of training they need locally at their own congregation, the practical stuff. Okay, we talked about a commissioning. We talked about preparing the congregation. We talked about preparing the person. We talked about preparing you. And now we're going to talk about the kinds of situations that you might meet. You are going to be assigned to visit a person in your congregation. I prefer a one-on-one relationship, but not every congregation does it that way. Another congregation in my town sends 2 people out to visit one person, and that changes from Sunday to Sunday. Now, both of these have good merits to them. The one I prefer is the one-on-one, till death do us part, because of the relationship developing. The other one, though, gives the person an opportunity to meet other people in the congregation. So maybe you could do that on a Sunday if their regular visitor isn't going to be available. Maybe they go on a cruise or something, and the second Sunday they're not going to be there. But we'll send you 2 other people so that they get to meet some other people from the congregation, as well as making the one-on-one relationship. You may be going to their apartment in town. You may be going to a nursing home. You may be going to a personal care section of the nursing home, or you may be going to the full care where they're lying in a bed. So there's different situations. The visit will depend on how the person is feeling and the condition of the person. If you start out visiting somebody who's just stopped driving and they're 91 years old and they have full capacity in their memory and can take part in the entire service that you bring with you, That's a different situation. That's where maybe a visit of 40 minutes is good because you can really establish a relationship versus somebody who's lying in bed in a nursing home or somebody in a dementia unit. The situations are going to be different. It's a good idea to start with somebody who is perfectly capable so that you can be with that person on their journey to the end. I had a phone call, in fact, yesterday because I told somebody I was doing this today, and that person said, oh, I need to retake that because there's some things I have questions about. How do you give communion to a person with dementia? And so that person was relieved that we were giving trainings more often so that now they can reconnect with their training because the person they give communion to is at a different stage in life. And I'm going to go into that in a minute. As I mentioned, you need to say the prayers because the prayers will open up feelings, situations in the person's life that you need to be attuned to. Their son and daughter-in-law are getting a divorce. That's very painful for the mother of the groom or the mother of the bride. And they may express that in the prayers, and you need to be attuned to that. Also, I had a situation one time where I went to visit somebody in the hospital, and it was pouring rain outside, and so I really wanted to have a long visit with this person. Enough so that I took off my raincoat and I sat there. And I just let her talk and talk and talk. And she did talk to me about her son and daughter-in-law who were getting a divorce. The doctors, she told me also, were having a real hard time trying to figure out why her body wasn't functioning to the point where she could go home. Well, she talked about this problem, and it just sort of like healed her to get it out. And the next day, she called me and said, guess what, Molly? I can go home. The tension had been released, and she could go home. I didn't do anything but give her the time and the presence so that she could talk about what her problem was. I also ask that if you're in a nursing home situation, you need to be attuned to the person who's in the room with them. You cannot ignore them completely. Usually, it's a good idea to offer to include them in the Eucharist with the person you're visiting from your church. If they don't want anything to do with it, that's fine. I do think that then it's polite to pull the curtain a little bit so that you are not imposing what you're doing on top of them. Now, what they hear, you cannot block out. And in fact, you may find when you're saying the Lord's Prayer, they're saying it too, because they really have come into it with you. We had a situation where I was taking this person out for their first visit and introducing them to the member of the congregation. And so we asked the roommate if she wanted to join it. Oh, yes. And about several months later, the roommate still comes in every time. And now she's saying to her daughter-in-law, I wonder why my church doesn't do this. And so she was being fed. This was an outreach ministry, in fact, now. She was being fed by the Eucharist from St. James. I had another instance where I was taking communion to a person who had moved to Lancaster from out of town, and her daughter-in-law had called up and said, my mother is an active Episcopalian, could you please have somebody take communion? So as the deacon, I took communion to this person. I invited the roommate, and every time I went, for several times, I invited the roommate and didn't want anything to do. So then I got into the habit of just pulling the curtain and carrying on with the person that I was visiting with the Eucharist. And one time I was there, we were getting ready to have the Eucharist, and I'm giving the bread to the person whom I'm visiting, and suddenly the person on the other side of the curtain sat bolt upright in bed and said, where's mine? So I went around and I gave her the Eucharist, and we finished up and I left, and the next time I went back I said to the person I was visiting, oh, what happened to your roommate? And she said, about an hour after you were here, she died. So that was a feeling she had that she needed to have it at that time. So you never know how you're going to make an impression on somebody else's life. So I do recommend that you have pay attention to the roommates. Now, if somebody is dying and you're taking communion to that person, sometimes they do prefer to have the clergy come at that point. So try not to be insulted. However, it can work the opposite way too. I had a gentleman who was giving communion in a nursing home to a lady who was dying. And her daughter was visiting from the state of Washington, and the daughter was not a church-going person, but she knew that her mother was and that this was important. So she called me up and she said, "Molly, I think it's time that my mother had Eucharist." So I said, "Well, I can come out this afternoon." Well, she said, she doesn't want the clergy. She wants her visitor to come. So I called the visitor and I brought him into the office and I said, "Now this is how you give communion to a dying person." And he went out after the healing service and gave the communion to the dying lady. And the daughter called me afterwards and was in tears. She said, "This was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. My mother and Steve having communion together." So, as I say, you may be the one they want to see, or their rector or deacon may be the one they want to see. And he gave the communion and was so reverent with her that it brought the unbelieving daughter to tears. So as I say, to always expect the unexpected to happen, because you never know what is going to happen when you get with your parishioner friend to give communion. Here's a kit that is used by the people at St. Luke's. Everything comes packed in this wonderful kit, and we use these at St. James as well. And if your congregation doesn't have enough kits or anything and you want to order some more, these are very good to have. They come from Augsburg, which is the Lutherans. So we're in communion with them in more ways than one. Now, I want to refer you to the book, if you have the book with you, to page 34 and 35, because we're going to practice setting up here. Oh, these are lovely linens. Everything is identified on page 34 with the name. And it's a good idea, if you're not on the Altar Guild, to start to learn these names. I'm going to use them as we talk, so there they are. But look on page 35, which is the setup for communion. I use the corporal is the piece of linen that goes on the bottom. And on top of the corporal, you put the chalice. And you have a bread box here. Now these bread boxes are very conveniently made so that the top becomes the paten for the hosts. However, it's not necessary that you use those. You can just use the bread box because there won't be more than 2 or 3 in here anyway. So that's up to how you want to do it, or how you are instructed in your parish to do it, I would say probably. You have the hosts in here. This little box is either called a bread box or a pyx. P-Y-X. Very good word to know for word games. And I've used it. My daughters ask, "Where'd you learn that word, Mom?" So then you have the water in here and wine, which is together, because this is already consecrated, and you pour a little bit into the chalice. You don't need to empty this, if depending on how much they put in. You don't need to empty it into. And then when you are starting with the service itself, you should cover the top of the chalice with the purificator. That's what that's called. So then you take the service booklet and you start going through the liturgy with the service booklet. You have with you the readings for the Sunday that you are representing, the collect, the gospel, and the other readings. You may say the prayer, and then you may ask them to read the gospel, or you may read the gospel, or their spouse or their child or whoever is also there may help you read the gospel, or your husband, or whoever is in your tiny little congregation. And then you don't forget to make comments about the sermon and the gospel, asking them how they feel the gospel has connected with their life. And then the part which I think is very important are the prayers. Now, this liturgy has a large section of prayers, responsive prayers. And it says at the bottom, let us pray for our own needs and those of others. And that's where you can ask who they want to pray for. There's also the confession here. And I had one gentleman visitor come back to me and say, Molly, is it all right if we use the confession from the 1928 prayer book? This gentleman was so old that the 1979 prayer book he hadn't quite gotten used to yet before he stopped coming to church, and he was now in his 90s, and he knew by heart the one from the 1928 prayer book. And so that was what they wanted to use. And then there is a form of absolution which lay people can use. And then you are led right into the Lord's Prayer. Each of these is very much the same as this one that I'm using, but just a little different. And that's another thing you need to go over with the person in your parish who is supervising you. When you are administering the communion, I suggest that you take into consideration common politeness. That means you serve the other person first, and then yourself. You know that at the altar, the priest takes the communion first, but you are not the priest, and you are using common politeness to serve the other person first, and then yourself. Or the other person and their sister or their daughter or whoever else is there, and finally yourself. When they have taken communion, if you're on a one-on-one basis, you will be amazed. They think, that's it. The service is over. And they'll start back on the conversation that you initiated at the beginning about their daughter and her husband or whatever. And you have to say, let's stop for a minute and thank God for what He has given us. And then you can say the prayer of thanksgiving at the end. But you will be amazed that sometimes they want to get back to the conversation. Then I suggest that when the service is finished, that I often would use their sink in their kitchen or in their nursing home room to wash out the cup. Because if you leave the wine in the cup, it damages the inside of the cup. So wash it out, even if you're going to return it to the altar guild and they're going to take care of it more seriously. But just wash out the cup, pack everything up, and then continue your conversation with the person. I suggest that you begin with a little conversation, you go to the Eucharist, and then listen for what they want to pray for, and then continue the conversation afterwards. So that, especially if you're in a nursing home and a shift is beginning to change and somebody comes in with meds or some other care thing they're going to do to your parishioner, that at least the Eucharist has not been interrupted. And I've had that happen. So I learned myself, after about 5 or 10 minutes of introductory pleasantries, that you do the Eucharist and then get back to the conversation. So it is also sometimes hard to know where you're going to set this up. Their tray tables may be filled with their mail, their magazines, and whatever. I have even used a Time magazine on the bed to put this on because they've got so much piled up on their tray tables. So use your sense of where you can do it when you're getting ready to do the Eucharist. I would suggest that if they're sitting down, that you get on the same level as they are. That's always a good connection so that you can be eye to eye with them and mouth to mouth. Stand up to give them the Eucharist and then sit back down again. I suggest also that you be very careful when you're going into the nursing home to let the staff at the desk know that you're there. Amazingly enough, sometimes their blood pressure goes up or down after a visit, and the nurses, if they don't know that somebody has been there, will wonder why. So take that little precaution with you. And these kids do not have candles with them, so therefore I wouldn't suggest that you use candles because you never know where somebody is going to be having oxygen that would explode if candles were used.